And joining us tonight on the debate for the full hour, Justin Trottier. He's president of the Free Thought Association of Canada. Author Kathy Shadle, who writes a blog called 5feetoffury.com. United Church Minister Greta Vosper, the chair of the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity. Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and the author of Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. And TVO viewers will well recognize Dr. Rob Buckman, author of Can We Be Good Without God? Behavior, Belonging, and the Need to Believe. Well, thanks everybody for being here this evening for what I'm sure will be a stimulating discussion. We want to remind everybody that our Thursday program is always informed by our viewers. So they have sent us their emails online telling us what show they think we ought to do. And tonight we had quite a conversation going online about this, so this is what we're doing tonight. We also would invite all of you to be involved in the broadcast. Send us your Twitters, your emails, however you like to get to us at the agenda at tvo.org, the agenda at tvo.org. We'll try to get as many of your questions and comments on the air as possible over the course of the hour. I want to put up two emails that we received already, and this will start our discussion this evening. Here's the first one. It says, pure and simple, I'm a theist, and I think the ads are wonderful. The ads in question we will see in a second. Here's the second one. I am so glad to see that finally another view will be aired to the public. As agnostic, leaning strongly towards atheism, and an active humanist, I feel that our voices have been silenced for too long. We've had to endure the ever-accepted presence of religious oppression in our society. We have far too long been forced to remain in the closet about who we are for fear of bigotry. Let's flip that over. And hatred towards us, and even threats of violence simply because we do not believe in God, Zeus, Allah, or any other so-called higher supernatural power. Humanists believe in reason, justice, equality, fairness, and compassion for all humans. Well, what are we talking about here tonight? We are talking about something that Toronto's transit system has decided to start, a new ad campaign for atheism. Shall we show this? Here it comes. There's probably no God, so says the ad. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. That's what the ads say, the so-called atheist bus. So let's go around the horn and get some opinions on this. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Rob Buckman, first impressions.
Well, I love the English campaign. The word probably was put in by the Advertising Standards Association. There's no proof, which of course there can't be. The great thing is if you can get over the idea that there's probably no God, so we're on our own to sort out our own messes. And in many respects, it's that bit. It's not, there's no point in a sterile argument whether there is or is not. It's only the influence on behavior that really matters. So I absolutely welcome it.
Justin, what's the purpose of these ads?
To generate the discussion that I think we've seen, to really bring atheists and non-theists into the mainstream. And we've seen that. The United Church and various secular and liberal-leaning Muslim and Christian and Jewish organizations have joined us to have a discussion on our website, on their websites, to really take this to the next level and show people that atheists have a point of view, not just on God, but on questions of ethics, questions of free expression, questions of religious accommodation, some of the really very important questions of the day.
Kathy, your view when you saw this ad?
Well, it's certainly an improvement. I'm old enough to remember when the public face of atheism was Madeleine Marie O'Hare, a rather purposefully unattractive woman who was so universally despised that she ended up being someone dismembered her with a chainsaw. So I'd like to congratulate everybody for at least toning it down slightly and presenting a slightly more attractive view. At least we know that no one is going to be left to die in the desert over this.
Greta Vosper.
I was amused when I first saw the ad because the first time I saw a picture of it, it had a picture of Richard Dawkins beside it. And I thought, how on earth did they get away with putting probably in there with Richard Dawkins? Because his idea of probably is that it should be completely taken out of the language relating to God. He's vitriolic about anyone who assumes that the tiny little whiff of a possibility should be completely expunged. So I laughed when I saw the probably. The conversation has to take place for exactly the same reasons that have been articulated already. But I do think that we need to get beyond just the conversation about whether there is or whether there isn't to how it affects our lives and how we choose to live our lives, whether we do or whether we don't.
We shall do some of that tonight. Jordan, your thoughts?
I think it's a juvenile publicity stunt pulled off by people who really neither know about nor care about the actual issues.
Get off the fence and tell me what you really think. Really, no redeeming features whatsoever? You've heard Justin say it's actually kind of provoked a bit of discussion.
Well, I don't really regard atheists as an oppressed group personally. I don't think there's any real historical evidence for that, especially in North America and Europe, and at least recently. And I think the debate is going fine without this sort of stunt, and I think it's basically a media manipulation ploy. It's a good one.
Intrude in there, if I may. You say the discussion's going fine, but I think you're alluding to the Theist Club discussion. You see in the pages of our national papers that religious organizations are frequently invited to discuss issues of ethics, issues of the interplay between science and faith, issues of the reasonable accommodations of religion. You rarely see an atheist or a proclaimed secular humanist from an organization or not actually being invited to participate until relatively recently. So when you say that our country is becoming more pluralistic,
I didn't say that.
Well, you're saying that we're including more people in the discussion. I think you're ignoring the fact that atheists are not part of that discussion until quite recently.
You've seen Dawkins, you've seen Hitchens, you've seen all these guys that write these books on atheism get massive amounts of media play. So it's not like they're excluded. If anything, they're dominant. So I don't buy that. Starting about
3 years ago, that's correct.
What's that?
Richard Dawkins' book came out about 3 to 4 years ago.
Yeah, so and it's got a perfectly fine reception. Mm-hmm. I mean, and there's no evidence that he's being oppressed, even though maybe he should be.
I don't think I used the word oppressed, did I?
I think his point is it's a fairly recent phenomenon that non-believers have been invited to partake in this discussion.
I don't agree. What about Bertrand Russell? I mean, Why I Am Not a Christian is still in print. God love us, after all these years, complete with all its misinformation and juvenile petulance. But so this isn't anything new. Like I said, I'm dating myself, but it seemed to me that every month Madeleine Murray O'Hair was on Phil Donahue and they would have a little fight. And, you know, this isn't new. Perhaps it's your youth that makes you think that it's a new argument.
Well, can I ask you about that word probably? Rob Buckman brought it up a second ago. Is it still considered provocative in 2009 to say there probably is no God?
I can't imagine. I mean, given the atmosphere in universities alone, although you know more about that than I do, I hazard a guess that the real provocative notion is that you're a believer, as the students at the University of Calgary who are pro-lifers discovered when they tried to have a public discussion, and the discussion was literally shut down by people who were calling themselves secular and liberal. So I think sometimes the default rebel position these days is the religious one, but it depends on what region, I think, of the world you're in.
Now that's an interesting, go ahead, Greta.
Well, there are a lot of people who have been within Christian community, mainline or evangelical, however, who have not been exposed to any kind of support within their communities or from the atheist or humanist communities, who have wanted to seek beyond traditional doctrinal experiences of their faith, and who have intuited or read or thought themselves to the edges of those doctrinal positions and want to go further, shake their worldviews a little bit. This ad campaign has allowed them to be affirmed in a way that they haven't been affirmed before, and that is a very important part of what I think this campaign has done, and has allowed them to seek out and find some community. And that's a big part of what we do at the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity, is try to bring people who are very isolated within faith communities, who have been brought up in traditional Christianity, have conversations with other people so that they don't feel so isolated. Because I don't know that it is that a faith position is necessarily the one that's marginalized these days. Perhaps in secular culture it may seem to be, but a lot of people have grown up within faith traditions and Christian faith traditions, I mean, and they have these very pervasive beliefs, and they invade the way that they understand themselves and what they've done that's right and wrong and how they're going to be judged for those actions.
Rob Buckman.
I think I agree with you strongly. I strongly disagree with Jordan's use of the word juvenile, because I think the word probably in there is not juvenile. It's actually quite thoughtful. And it really is. I know it was put there, as I said, by the Advertising Council, not by the original people. But it's a fabulous way of saying what you believe cannot be proven, which is a very important definition of belief. And therefore, it makes it mature, not juvenile.
Yeah, I mean, when we decided, the Free Thought Association of Canada, on what ad to use here, what slogan, we opted for the probably, and that was our choice. The Transit Commission never said whether we had to put that in there. We think it's more intellectually honest because we are atheists, agnostics, skeptics, we're doubters. We thought that that was a more profound statement to make. But I also want to pick up on something Greta said.
Forgive me, let me just interrupt there.
Okay.
So you're not just representing atheists, you are representing a broader community.
We're trying to build a big tent, and Greta mentioned community. We're big into that. We often hear that atheists and humanists don't do charitable things, that we have no community. And part of that is true, and we're trying to build that. And people often ask us if all we're doing is trying to raise membership. That's not the first priority, but we are trying to get people together so we can be a voice for them and do some good things together.
Thus the probably, because an atheist, of course, there's no probably.
Right, and it would be a much smaller market that we'd be touching into.
I'm sorry, I interrupted. You wanted to make a second point as well.
That was it, actually, the community aspect. That's the first priority of what we're doing.
Jordan?
Well, I guess, you know, there was a little bit of discussion a couple of minutes ago about shaking people's worldviews. You know, and it's not something to be done lightly. So if you, I mean, I'm very interested in what happens to people when their belief systems collapse, and not only what happens to people individually, but also socially. And so what I've learned about that's most profound, I think, probably came from turn-of-the-century thinkers like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, who were very much concerned about the demolition of belief structures. And Nietzsche, the philosopher, is a real interesting case in point because he's the originator of the famous phrase, God is dead. But that isn't the phrase. That's just the phrase that people like to remember. The phrase is, God is dead and we have killed him and there won't be enough water to wash away the rivers of blood. And the rest of that phrase is a prophecy for the 20th century that he wrote 25 years before the 20th century began, stating quite clearly that he believed that hundreds of millions of people would be killed in the 20th century because of the decline of standard religious beliefs. That people would turn, in particular, and he prophesied this as well, in particular they would turn to communism. So, you know, none of this is a game. It's very dangerous.
Full quote changes the meaning of that quite significantly.
Yeah, a lot.
Rob Buckman?
I think rivers of blood, unfortunately, are a human characteristic. I would argue with you very strongly that it was not the decline of religion that led to so many millions of dead. There have been millions of dead in the name of religion long before there was any possibility of decline.
Well, not millions.
That argument is also, I think,
yes,
very...
millions, if you add up.
That argument is also...
Over here and then over here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's an interesting argument because in one way it's true and in one way it's not. So the thing about global scale religions is that they unite many, many millions of people. Now within that union there's relative peace. Of course the problem is that there's different global religions, and then on the borders between those religions there's still war. Now people who don't like religious systems point to the battle between religions, but they never really notice that within the religions themselves millions of people are brought into a big tent, let's say. So you know, you can't have it both ways. Religion unites and it divides, and if you're going to, you know, pay close attention to the facts, you've got to give due credit to both
I do want to keep the discussion on the ads themselves, but given that you made that point, I feel obliged to let you follow up.
I don't think anybody's after forcing people to convert to atheism. We're not talking about Stalin or Hitler or any of those really pathetic attempts that people make to put all of atheism.
You don't think you're talking about that.
Well, let me finish what I was going to say, please. What I would like to see is more critical thinking. There are lots of societies where they have great critical thinking and science education. People willingly choose to adopt atheism or secularism. I'm thinking of Northern European countries, and books have been written that have studied the levels of atheism and secularism in countries like Sweden and Denmark. They have great community programs, great social welfare programs. They found a way to adopt to a secular society and build a community without needing to rely on churches.
Okay, Jordan, let me follow up with you on this. You work in the university community, which is supposed to be about challenging assumptions and really getting at the core of things. If this bus campaign makes people question assumptions, some would say assumptions that are made without thought, isn't that a good thing?
Well, I would say a lot of your assumptions are made without thought, and that's partly because a lot of the assumptions that people have are so complicated they can't figure them out. I would also say that, you know, you have to believe things. Like everyone's morality is predicated on faith. Now there are people who will object to that characterization, but as far as I'm concerned, the psychological data that pertain to that is it's established beyond belief.
Everyone's
morality is predicated on faith. And the reason for that is that there's no, first of all, there's two reasons. One is that you can't know everything. And what that means is that at the bottom of your belief structure, something has to bottom out in faith. That takes the place of absolute knowledge. And the second part of it is that moral decisions themselves aren't based on objective descriptions of the world. They're based on something else, like a faith in the right thing to do. It's not a matter of scientific debate, morality.
I got an example.
Wishy-washy, Jordan. What you're saying is not necessarily what the debate is about. It doesn't say there's probably no such thing as faith. It says there's probably no God. And the point about this argument is really about whether a supernatural force that affects humankind's destinies has an existence. And so far, until very, very recently, that was the assumption. And still at this moment, probably 99.9% of the world believe that there is such a thing as a God. And the beauty of this debate is it's challenging the assumption in the existence of a supernatural being, not in the way you use the word in faith, but in faith in the supernatural, that's all.
And if we go back to the ad campaign themselves and the original ad that was written to respond to some Christian ads that sent people to a website that said that they were going to go to hell for eternity if they did not believe in salvation as given to them by Jesus Christ. So the original ads responded to that. Without that as a background, they may not stand alone as well. But the ends of the ad, so don't worry now, enjoy your life. If you're talking about not being a God, there being no God, then you have nothing to worry about. Or as the United Church campaign came back saying, there probably is a God, so if there is a God, you don't have anything to worry about. If that's your worldview, if your worldview is predicated on there being one or there not being one, if there is not one, then you don't have anything to worry about. The intimation there is that then God isn't going to do bad things to you, which is a very basic premise in our worldview.
Whose worldview? The
worldview of those who are afraid of that kind of God, and the intimation in that particular ad campaign. Or that in the other ad campaign, it's that now God is going to take care of everything. So either of those foundational worldviews have problems with them. But the one that's a belief one, that God is going to take care of everything, I think is a particularly dangerous belief system in this day and age. We can't afford to rely on a deity that we think is going to come in and sweep in and make the world a better place.
Jordan, then Justin.
Well, the issue that Rob Buckman raised with regards to faith, well, the question is, sure, but it doesn't make any difference, because the question then becomes faith in what? Okay, so look at it this way. You can have a coherent system of faith or an incoherent system of faith. Coherent one's better, usually. If the faith system is coherent, there's an ultimate value at its pinnacle. Whatever that ultimate value is, for you, it's God. Now, you might not think so, but the thing about belief is it doesn't really matter what you think about belief, because you don't understand the structure of your own beliefs, and generally they're manifested in action and not in speech. And technically speaking, the value that's at the pinnacle of your hierarchy, whatever that is, for all intents and purposes, that's God. Now, you don't have to believe that, and you don't have to know it, but that's still how it works out.
Justin.
Well, here we are debating faith and atheism, which really is not the introductory debate that we were going to have, but I think it does prove that the ad campaign has been a success, because it's an exact example of the debate we wanted to have. So thank you for participating in that. But to get to what Greta was saying, to get back to that and what I think we're here to discuss, Greta, I appreciated your editorial this week in the Toronto Star, but to tell us that ad on the bus, that's our foundational worldview, to use the words you just used, it's a bit superficial. We're trying to get the debate open. Then we can talk about what our worldview is. If I can defend the use of that, the second part, now, stop worrying and enjoy your life, or relax and enjoy your life. Who are we talking to there? We're talking to a large group of people who are starting to think critically, who are starting to think skeptically, and that is scaring them, because they still have one leg in their faith traditions. And they're worried. What if they're wrong? What if they are going to meet their maker? And he's not going to be too happy with them. And so to those people, we're saying, if your critical thinking leads to a position of doubt, that's okay. Embrace the doubt. Skepticism is not bad.
And I think that that's the least problematic of the two, right?
Let me hear from Kathy on this, because we haven't heard from you a bit, Kathy. What do you think of this second part of the bus ad which says, now stop worrying and enjoy your life.
It's funny to me how critical thinking always ends up equating with the latest leftist fads. But I can't let this go by. You were saying that, you know, isn't it wonderful that in certain countries where they have a lot of atheism, they also have these fabulous social programs. Not all of us believe that nanny statism is fabulous. And I would also argue that in the very nations that you mentioned, what is rushing in to fill the vacuum left by multicultural atheism in places like Denmark? Radical Islam. So you can, I think your fight may be with a sort of Christianity that no longer exists, especially in places like Europe, that is some sort of fantasy from, you know, 200 or 300 years ago. And perhaps the real problem is one that you'll have a much harder time dealing with mere bus ads.
Do we want to put this email out now, Michael? Should we go to this? Okay. Again, we're welcoming your emails at the agenda at tvo.org. We just got this one in from John, who says, I think it's more than a little ironic that atheists who have for years protested the presence of faith and religion in the public arena are now promoting their views so publicly. I welcome the opportunity for free and open discussion on the things of God. Is there more, or is that it? Okay. Does anybody want to comment on the irony of this?
Pick up on that. I don't think it's ironic at all. There are some atheists, I don't know very many of them, I don't think myself or Dr. Buckman would be in that category, who believe that to be a secular society one must be devoid of religiosity. No, I think that all points of view, religious and secular, should be part of the public space, that politicians can freely talk about religion so long as the public space isn't saturated by it to the extent that it becomes the sort of dominant ethos, that the public space is no longer a neutral one.
Well, it is a bit of a prerequisite down south, isn't it?
Right, and so there's an issue with that. But here I think we found a much better way to accommodate that discussion without endorsing a worldview in the public space. I'm a big fan of free speech. You mentioned the situation with abortion groups on campus, anti-abortion groups that have been banned. You should know that the Free Thought Associations, the Center for Inquiry group that I direct, our campus groups have been the first groups to speak out against the banning of those anti-abortion student clubs. We're not hypocritical on our defense of free speech.
I think you had some letters to the editor and some papers on that this past week, which I did see. Rob Buckman, talk to me about this. You may know Arthur Brooks, the social scientist. I think he just got...
Would you pretend I don't?
Okay.
Okay, right.
I think he just took over at the American Enterprise Institute, but he's been a well-regarded university professor in, I think, in upstate New York, Syracuse. He argues quite compellingly with lots of information that in the aggregate, religious people are happier than non-religious people.
Oh, yeah, no
and he's got the
argument,
data to prove it.
Oh, I don't have any argument with that at all. I mean, happiness in the sense of distress. I mean, one of my television series, I went around West Virginia, where they did the snake biting thing, you know, they dance. And actually there are studies that show this weird sect, I mean, by any standards, including of all Christian churches in the US, but they are actually less neurotic and less worried because they do believe in God will save him. They dance with the snakes and do all this other stuff. Happiness, unfortunately, isn't the only criterion that you can measure it by.
Pretty big one, though, isn't it?
Not necessarily.
Not
because
necessarily?
It's happiness for whom? I mean, you could, for example, before the abolition of slavery, if you owned a plantation, you were probably very happy. What was wrong with that picture? Well, there's this chap called Abraham Lincoln who said there was something wrong with that picture, and let's sort it out. So merely one group being intensely happy is undoubted, but not necessarily the criterion. I would never even debate this subject if it were not for the fact that people in the human race are so ready to kill each other because of a concrete belief in God. And we know that why that is. When I talk about it in my book, mentioned by Dawkins, that unfortunately the brain system for aggression and translating emotion into action is unfortunately easily fed into by the bit of the brain that processes belief. So tragically, human beings are programmed to take cudgels up and swords up in the name of what they believe in. That's the problem, not anything else.
So,
Jordan and, all right, Kathy, then Jordan.
So what God was Stalin killing 30 million people in the name of?
Very important point, a really seriously important point. Stalin did undoubtedly kill some people because they were religious. Most of the people that Stalin killed, and I have read the books, I promise you, were not actually killed in the name of atheism.
No, you're missing my point.
No, no.
He was an atheist.
No, I know.
And he was killing people in the name of atheistic communism.
No, I disagree with that latter bit completely. It's like saying Hitler was a vegetarian and therefore millions of people died in the name of vegetarianism. He was a vegetarian. The slaughters and the deaths that he caused were not in the name or the cause of vegetarianism. It is very complicated to work out exactly what Stalin was doing, other than...
Not to me.
Well, actually, yes, you're right. The power structure was an absolute pyramid. But it certainly wasn't killing people because they were atheists as opposed to theists. That wasn't the issue.
So no, he was killing people because, as a rational man, his conclusion that life was so unbearable it should be wiped out. You know, you guys who are in, hang on a second. You guys who are into, you know, rational thinking, forget all the time that rational thinking can go in a variety of directions. It depends on your initial presuppositions. If you believe that life is worth living, which, by the way, under some conditions is highly debatable, you're going to come up with a pretty optimistic conclusion. But if you've looked at life and you think that the suffering of most people is unbearable and that life is evil, which is what Stalin thought, you have no problems whatsoever mobilizing everything you can to kill as many people as you can. And if you don't have any faith, in an ultimate authority that says essentially that life is sacred, what's to stop you from doing that?
But if
the fact that you have good impulses.
It's called morality.
Yeah, where does that come from?
Well, Stalin and I differed in terms of morality.
Why?
Why?
Yeah, why?
You're being very rude, Jordan. You're being very rude indeed. My morality is, as it were, on display simply on the way I actually choose to live my life. And I did emigrate to Canada out of choice. And I hope that Canada hasn't
Well, and I know you
yet.
deal with very difficult things.
Yes, I do.
I know that.
And I'm not Stalin. And it's very unfair to say that anybody who doesn't believe in God cannot have a morality. That was the title.
That isn't exactly what I said. I said that rationality can go in two directions. That's what I said.
Okay, Greta wanted a word here.
No, I just wanted to point out that if you have a belief in it, your belief system and your worldview will, of course, help you make decisions about what you hallow and what you do not. And if your belief system posits that there is an afterlife real estate which has much more value and much more worth than the one here, and that life there is going to be much more favorable and much more beautiful and much more desirable than the one here, then you will want those that you love to experience that in the best possible way that they can. And you will, you know, you don't need to be an atheist to find that life here is wretched and not worth living. Then you can be a very strong theist
and
jump
in
have
for a second.
exactly the same
Forgive me,
argument.
jump in. Since his name has come up a few times already on the program tonight, Richard Dawkins, why don't we hear from the man? He was in this studio not too long ago and had this to say about that which we are speaking this evening. Roll tape.
People who believe they get their moral values from religion. Where do atheists get their moral values from, if not religion?
I very much hope that religious people don't get their moral values from religion.
But we know they do. We know many of them do.
We do not. If they did, then they'd be stoning people to death for showing an inch of skin. If you've ever read many of the early books of the Old Testament, you would not wish to get your morals from
I was just going to say, you're being awfully Old Testament with me here, but...
Well, why not? I mean, if you're going to say, well, I get my morals from the New Testament and not the Old Testament, you're picking and choosing. And you're picking and choosing on what basis? You're picking and choosing on the basis of a modern, contemporary view of what's moral.
So we've talked about Dawkins, we've talked about Hitchens, and I think it's fair to say, and particularly I think, Justin, you referred to it in the past few years, I think it's fair to say that atheism is kind of hot now. There's a great deal of discussion about it, Kathy, and I wonder what you would attribute the rise in that heat to.
That's complicated. To be perfectly honest with you, I think a lot of the recent discussions have been motivated by this sort of bizarre psychological hatred of Christian conservatives in the United States of America. It's basically the last acceptable prejudice.
So this is a reaction to that, you think?
I think so. I think some of it is there was a, things go in fads, and as I said before, I think there are atheistic fads and there are Christian fads.
The prejudice against religious folk. Sorry,
Absolutely.
The statistics that we saw in the States a couple years ago suggested which demographic was the least trusted. Was it religious or atheists? I think it was atheists. So where are you getting this sort of belief from?
Well, I get it from making the mistake of leaving the house and encountering people who, because they consider themselves urban sophisticates who want to be invited to the best cocktail parties, think absolutely nothing of saying the most slanderous, libelous, and frankly crude, mean-spirited things about Christians, most of whom they have never actually met.
Don't get us in trouble, but what are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about the fact that it's almost impossible to watch Comedy Central or to go to a movie or to watch my favorite would be Law and Order, in which inevitably the nasty villain blowing up the abortion clinic is this crazed Christian, even though I think there have been something like 7 abortion doctor deaths since 1972. That's 7 too many, but certainly television shows often present the born-again Christian as either a moron or as someone to be mocked and laughed at.
Well, we can discuss what worldview most villains have. I would suggest most villains are labeled as believing in themselves, as atheists who believe in nothing but greed and profit and all of that. But we can discuss contemporary culture. I think that's a kind of trivial and trite example. Let's talk about the ad campaign. In Britain, after the atheist ads were put up, which said there's probably no God, it's the same ad that we have, you know the slogan. Some religious organization is now trying to put up ads that describes atheism as a dark and sinister force that's been defeated now that their money's run out to put up ads. A dark and sinister force. How can you compare that level of vitriol to our ads? You talk about immature ads. Do you want to compare the actual facts on the ground?
Well, I'd say that there is a bit of a premise problem there. You seem to be suggesting that if you're an atheist, then you don't worry and you have a happy life. And I think what you're doing is pricking at people who feel that they're not worried and having quite a happy life, thank you very much. I don't know. I've met atheists who are worried and miserable, and atheists who are happy. I've met Christians who are worried and miserable, and Christians that are happy.
Just like atheists and theists can both be good and both be evil.
And they're, well, of course, but it seems to me that the ad is a little bit of a poke at people saying, you miserable, worried people handling snakes. I mean, 20 people do that in the entire United States of America. Okay. There's no reason to keep bringing that up. But again, these are the stereotypes that people
Rob and
enjoy.
Jordan, please.
So I kept up. The important thing is, enjoy your life. What the real message in there, which I think we're all kind of agreeing on, is try not to kill anybody in the name of this God.
Yes.
That's the important thing. If nobody had ever been in the last 5,000 years killed in the name of a God or gods, probably this wouldn't be an argument at all. What we're really talking about is, as it were, practical morality, practical ethics in terms of the behavior, the fairness of the whole planet. And I would say that the argument that atheism is a dark and sinister force is kind of a bit disproven when you look at young Trottier here and you look at me. I mean, we may be ugly, but we're not dark or sinister.
Speak for yourself.
We really are. I will speak for myself. I am ugly, but I am not dark and sinister. And that's the argument.
Jordan, one sec. Jordan, and over here.
The other thing about that ad that I think is pretty funny, because it's not the part that people concentrate on, is the second part. It's like, don't worry, be happy. If that's, like, is that supposed to be the alternative good? That's what you're supposed to be doing with your life. If you don't believe in God, you're supposed to be not worrying and being happy. Wait, let me finish.
Sure.
The thing is that it's perfectly possible that the highest value to which people should be devoted is neither the quelling of worry nor being happy. And the fact that that is the other half of that statement indicates to me the level of moral reasoning that underlies the motives for putting the ad on the bus.
Just curious, what's more important than either of those things?
Pursuing things that are meaningful, that's more important. Trying to order yourself so that you act morally, really regardless of whether or not it makes you happy, or maybe even, look, I just heard a journalist today, a journalist's wife, who talked about her husband in Sri Lanka, who pursued the truth knowing full well that he was going to be killed because he believed that the totalitarian atrocities of the state were unbearable. Now, he wasn't not worrying, and he wasn't being happy. And the idea that those are the aims to which life should be devoted is, Solzhenitsyn said, you know, that belief is demolished by the first boots that kick down your door. And that's absolutely right.
Greta.
And I agree with some of that sentiment because I think that we do need to go beyond that. But I'm wondering if one of the important things that we're missing here is the whole concept of how we live and whether or not a values-based focus that I think faith-based traditions have been missing because we've been trying to figure out how to do religion instead of what religion should be helping us do, and that's figure out how to live our lives. And if we were living in a values-based way, we wouldn't be talking to people in that manner at those cocktail parties, and we wouldn't be blogging using the way that we, you know, we're all very bold when we're behind our keyboards, and we speak and we say things that we perhaps wouldn't say to someone's face in a cocktail party. We wouldn't treat each other the way that we treat each other, and we would find ways to settle differences that wouldn't end up with our doors being kicked down. And I think that faith traditions have much to offer by way of helping people walk through the difficult challenges of being in relationship with each other, either on a grand scale, country to country, faith tradition to faith tradition, or on the little scale of person to person. And I think that that's what we should be challenging one another to do.
Rob,
and that's what our faith tradition should be doing.
Sure. Can I throw out an idea to you here? The tragedy often, you know, people have reacted one way or another to tragedy. Post 9/11, do you think 9/11 encouraged more people to say there's no God?
No.
I agree with Greta. Unfortunately, it was the exact opposite. It was, I have to say, 10/11 was very, very hard for atheists. I mean, it was very difficult. We saw on 9/11 exactly what people will do in the name of a God, and then they say, and the alternative is, and the alternative is much more complicated than one single word. It's something to do with human relationships at all levels, and it's certainly something to do with being fulfilled. And if I could just put the little sort of thing under that poster, it would say there's probably no God. Even more important than enjoy life is be fulfilled. P.S. Don't kill anybody in the name of God or gods.
After Katrina ripped through New Orleans, the belief in God skyrocketed as well. And a few weeks ago, I left a message on a news producer's phone machine because I was so distraught that a news report juxtaposed two horrific stories. One where a young child had been killed in a terrible tragedy, and the next story was a story about someone who had also been in a tragedy but had been saved, and they played a clip of that person, someone from that person's family, explaining that they had been saved because God had reached down and taken care of that person. And the juxtapositions of those two stories was absolutely irresponsible and horrific, and I was
Why?
horrified
Because it
by that.
reflected reality?
No, not because it reflected that if there is a God and God turned his or her back on that 5-year-old child.
That was her opinion. That was the opinion of a person.
Well, a news
who
producer, for a news producer to put those two things side by side, it was irresponsible. If you want to put those two things, I think it's irresponsible for a news producer to put anyone's opinion about whether God saved someone or not on the news, and I've written letters to
well,
that.
that's unfortunate because it's just another aspect of human nature. I don't understand why that's unfortunate, except that it annoys you.
Hang on, let's hear from Greta.
No,
what would be the problem with doing that?
Because the implication is that someone who dies or someone who didn't have that kind of care given to them, a colleague of mine one time experienced a horrific tragedy in his own family as the result of a natural disaster. The next day in the newspaper was a family who had obviously not experienced that same tragedy, but been in the same natural disaster, and with the headline saying, God was with us. So the implication is always that God is not in the other place.
That was their opinion. I mean,
that may be their opinion, but I'm saying
right?
the news people should not be reinforcing that perspective of God with and God without.
You seem to have a rather strange idea about the average person, perhaps you think that they're so dim-witted that unless news people manipulate them and tell them how to behave.
Let's not make this personal here.
Well, no, but I'm just saying that, you know, the idea that these poor lambs who are watching TV will be manipulated by the fact that they saw a human being say something in a moment of distress and fear, and they expressed their opinion. And the idea that ordinary people watching the news have to be assisted by TV producers to think a certain way, or else I don't know what the
I don't think that was her point.
Well,
anyway.
that's what I'm getting from that, is
Jordan?
that people will be manipulated.
I wanted to say something about those snake handlers. I know a professor at the University of Tennessee named Ralph Hood, who's probably the world's leading authority on the psychology of religion, and he spent a lot of time interviewing and dealing with those snake handlers. And they're very interesting people in many ways, because they say, for example, well, you know, when you go to church, nothing necessarily happens, but when I go to church, I don't know whether I'm going to come out alive or not. And they're not stupid. Now, there's also something very interesting psychologically behind what they do. So we know, for example, from decades of psychotherapy work, that one of the most therapeutic things you can do for someone is have them voluntarily face the things they're afraid of. And most archaic cultures do that with their juvenile males, particularly during initiation. And I think there's good evidence to suggest that that sort of voluntary facing of fear, which is something like acceptance of vulnerability, helps regulate the nervous system. Because it, like, lots of people worry about really trivial things, eh? And so, but if you go through something that's really not trivial and something that's really dangerous, it gives your nervous system a reference point against which you can then judge the things that happen to you. So even the snake handlers aren't necessarily so insane.
Justin, a word for you, and then I want to cycle in another email here. Go ahead.
You're talking about male circumcision, or what I call male genital mutilation. That is
I'm
not trivial. You talked
I'm not
about,
talking about that.
well, that is one example of what,
about,
and that's not voluntary. You talk about
I'm not
taking,
talking about that. I'm talking about the initiation
let me talk now.
ritual.
You've said quite a few things in the last 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
You've said two things that are completely contradictory. Okay, you talk about that you're referring to infants, and you talked about referring to young, you said young men.
Infants.
You did say young men.
Yeah,
okay?
but
And you said
infants are not young
voluntary.
men.
But that doesn't go together. If
I'm
you're
not
gonna,
talking about
when
infants.
this comes down, let me try to get a full sentence out before you interrupt me.
You're putting words in his mouth that he says ought not to be there. So what are you trying to...
He did say young people, and
No,
he
I
did...
said young men.
Okay, young men.
And young men are not infants.
Well, young men are not doing something voluntary until they're old enough to choose for themselves. What I think a lot of this comes down to is individualism versus group rights. And I think you had a show this week on individualism, whether it's gone too far. I'm a big fan of individual rights. And I think that to suggest that we should have a culture in which we sort of give groups the ability to self-regulate to the extent that we put our young men or young women through ordeals of initiation, as you put it.
I didn't
mean,
suggest
that's
that we
abhorrent.
should
That's one of the
do that.
dangers of religion.
I said that there are many archaic cultures that do that, and that there's a reason for it. I didn't say we should do it, and I didn't say we should do it to
Okay, let me
infants.
jump in here, because first of all, full marks to you. We did do that program last night, Individualism in the Time of Cholera, or whatever we called it. Let's get another email in here if we can, Michael. We'll bring this one up. We just got this in just now. It is worth noting, the emailer says, that Obama, in his inaugural address, acknowledged America is made up of many faiths, including Islam, and specifically included Americans, quote, who do not believe in God. Now, I'm sure all of you picked up on that reference in his speech. That was I mean, that was a fairly extraordinary thing for an American politician to say. What did you think when you heard it?
My immediate thought was that it's time to reprint the American dollar, and it should say, in God or not, we trust.
Do you object to that being on the dollar?
Not in the slightest.
You don't?
And I'm really serious about it. I mean, there is a serious point here. That actually, the in God we trust on the dollar does demonstrate that there is a value, and I'm picking my words carefully, there is a value of interactions between us. I give you a dollar, you give me a dollar, whatever. There is a value in their interactions, which is actually, if you use Jordan's word, the faith that we have in the dollar, which may shake it from time to time. It's not in the faith of God. And I actually, strangely, not only don't mind, but I'm actually glad that the dollar bills have got God printed on it, and the value of the dollar is the value, a secular value of the transaction between us, because it's an allegory.
Kathy, I'm interested in your view on when you, I presume you watched Obama give the inaugural?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
Oh,
you're the one person I've met who
great.
has not watched it.
You need to be in broader circles. If I
I'm
wanted,
sorry, I just thought this was one of the most remarkable historical events of all time, and I thought most people would want to watch
not
it.
particularly. No, if I want to
Not
hear,
particularly?
if I want to hear a Marxist professor talk for an hour, I would have gone to college.
Okay, well, if you didn't see it, I won't ask you about it then. Did you watch it? Obama's inaugural?
I've watched parts of it
Okay,
on the
did
web.
you see the reference to the, anyway, you know the reference to non-believers, which he said, which I think probably is the first time non-believers have been referred to in an inaugural address in a respectful fashion. What did you think of it when you heard
Good
about
for
it?
him, yeah. Like, I fully believe that people should express whatever opinions they have. Just doesn't mean they're right. I wanted to talk about that dollar bill thing, too. You know, because there is a reason for that phrase. And the reason is this, is that financial interactions are predicated on trust. And trust is predicated on mutual integrity. And the idea that you should act in an integral manner is rooted in a historical sequence of ideas that suggest that inside each person there's something that's divine. And that's rooted in the idea that there's something about consciousness that mediates between chaos and order. It's a very complex set of logic. And the reason that the financial system is embedded in that is because trust in integrity and in moral goodness is actually the foundation of the financial state. So it isn't just an accident of history, and it's not something that should be tampered with lightly. So
It's only been there for 50 years, you know. The In God We Trust. It doesn't go back to the founding of the country. It's only been there since Ike. Okay, go ahead.
Question. Did I just hear Kathy say that she didn't listen to President Obama because if she wanted to spend an hour listening to a Marxist professor? That's what you said.
She did.
Okay, your opinion is entirely your own.
One thing
You're
that's
entitled to it.
Sorry
He's
to
a
interrupt you there.
Marxist. I
One thing
don't see
that's
what the
forgotten,
problem
he
is.
didn't only say that, he didn't only acknowledge the existence of atheists. In other speeches, he's actually mentioned humanism alongside Confucianism and Buddhism and other ethical systems.
What do you think the significance of that is?
Well, he's acknowledging that atheists don't just exist. That's a fact claim. I mean, you know, it's nice to have that acknowledgement, don't get me wrong, but he's actually going further and suggesting, or actually explicitly saying that humanists, atheists and secularists can actually find a moral code alongside, and that complements religious ones.
Greta, what did you think? I mean, the inaugural address of a new president is arguably, you know, one of the most important speeches that will ever be given anywhere in the world that year. And he mentioned non-believers, which, if I'm right,
It
I
was
don't...
an important thing for him to do, given that many of the official events of the inaugural week were opened and closed and grounded entirely in Christian, the presence of Christian.
There was a lot of that in the inaugural as well.
So it was very good that he did include that right in his address. So it recognized that we aren't just talking about a Christian nation here. There are a lot of other perspectives there.
So, Rob, you appreciated the reference to non-believers in the inaugural.
I really did.
Okay,
Seriously.
were you, I don't know if offended is the right word, but were you upset about the fact that, you know, Rick Warren came up there to give an invocation, there were other religious figures who came
I have to say
forward?
the whole thing.
I was offended that Rick Warren was doing that.
Intellectually, I would have preferred it if he wasn't, but it really didn't upset me in the context of that speech and that occasion. I thought, in some respects, the Rick Warren and the songs and and the music contributed to an emotional tone, and I thought that acknowledging the existence and the sort of convergence or confluence of the potential collaboration with people of different faiths was actually more important than me getting intellectually upset by mention of the songs or In God We Trust on the Dollar. I mean, that was that level of irritation. It wasn't
Acknowledging plurality is great, but if this diversity is founded on the the illusion that we all have this belief in God in common, which is reinforced by these official religious ceremonies, I think that's leaving out a lot of people. And we talk about building group cohesion through religiosity. We leave out, what, 5–6% of Americans. In Canada, thankfully, we don't have the same problem. It would be leaving out maybe 20% of Canadians. That's a problem.
Give it time.
It's
You're right, but give it time.
It's also that, I mean, you can't just wipe out recognition of someone just by labeling them as a Marxist and saying, okay, I'm not going to listen to anything they say. And also, you can't just say, oh, well, Rick Warren, if you're going to have Christians, okay, it's Rick Warren's fine because he's a Christian. Within that scope and the definition of all those people, there are different perspectives, and Rick Warren's was one that was very offensive to be included there.
I thought it was smallly offensive.
His whole exclusion of gays and lesbians and his work in California to have Prop 8 destroyed or or all of that work destroyed in California was a significant part.
I want to do
So
one more thing,
including
but
him
go
was
ahead.
difficult.
I don't
You come back on
understand
this.
why I can't think that way.
Oh, absolutely, you can think that way. I just think that putting a label on someone and then dismissing them because of the label I just think that that's unhelpful.
And I don't, so.
Okay.
Well, that's fine.
Less than 4 minutes to go. Let me read one more thing here. This is out of the National Post from a couple of months ago, and Michael, if you could, let's bring this up here. We're calling this the separation of church and state. The aggressive militants, such as Dawkins and Hitchens, also don't seem to realize that secular humanism has already won. Its enemies are frightening and vicious, but marginal, and increasingly so. Freedom of religion in democratic capitalism has largely meant freedom from religion. Today, most people of faith do not, as they should, believe that members of other faiths are automatically damned. People live like secularists, even if they don't call themselves secularists. America is supposedly the hotbed of religious revivalism, but take a walk in Times Square and tell me if that's the center of a Christian civilization or a pagan one. Who wants in on that?
I think it's time for us to go home. I agree with that.
I think it's true.
People often just label atheists as pagans. I see that all over the place. What is that all about? When I go to Times Square, I don't see evidence of paganism any more than Christianity. So I'd like to know what he's basing that on. It's an unfair caricature, I think.
Well, do you agree with the premise of the piece, which is that, you know,
it's over.
The secularists have already won?
Yeah.
You think that's true?
Well, the thing is not exactly, because people can't do without belief. And so, you know, one of the things, and this is one of the things I think that's really flawed in the thinking of people like Dawkins, is that Dawkins believes that if people abandoned their traditional religious beliefs, including their belief in God, that they would inevitably move to a kind of rational, secular humanism. And I think that's completely absurd. I think people, like Dostoevsky thought, I think we have very irrational souls. You know, very powerful, romantic, emotional, highly motivated souls. And the idea that the abandonment of traditional forms of religion is going to lead us to some sort of rational light is like, look at the 20th century. Why would you believe that, even for a second?
Kathy, do you think the secular humanists have already won the war where it comes to the public space?
No, I think there's almost well, then there would be no such thing as the culture wars. I mean, we wouldn't really be having this conversation. So I could be wrong, but just for the sake of argument, I'll say it's 50-50, and it kind of goes like this, and it's yin-yang, and I don't think they've won. I don't think Christianity's won. I think that there's always going to be that
Wouldn't
fight.
you say the culture wars are in remission right now?
Not in my world, but that's
Not in your world, okay, fair enough. But the last American election was as about absent from culture wars as, you know, listen, of any of the last 5 or 6 or 7, I think there was a remarkable lack of culture wars in this last federal election in the United States. Do you not agree?
I think we're listening to 2 different kinds of broadcasts and reading many different newspapers, and we thought there was a war on. So I guess other people did feel like fighting it.
Who's the we?
I'd say conservatives felt that I mean, to me, conservatives have their deeply held beliefs, liberals have their deeply held beliefs. The idea that there should be some kind of fakey unity was getting some of us a little disturbed. And so, yeah, I think in my world, which unfortunately there are 2, it is a divided America, a divided North America to a lesser extent. We thought there was a war going on.
Last minute to go here, and okay, Rob Buckman, you get it here. Is there a part of you that wishes that Dawkins and Hitchens would shut up a little bit?
Temper what they say. It's simply in this, that there's a huge gulf between belief and behavior. Belief is totally okay. Anyone can believe in anything, invisible flying spaghetti monster. It's when you pick up a sword or whatever and you decide to kill your neighbor because he doesn't believe in the same color of invisible flying spaghetti monster. And in many respects, it's the goal to separate belief from behavior that really matters and make all of these debates, you know, solved.
I'm reminded by our producer Meredith Martin that you got the last word the last time you were on this program, and I suspect that's because you seem to wrap things up on time, which is a very nice thing when you're trying to anchor a discussion. Can I thank, please, for appearing on the program tonight, Justin Trottier, Greta Vosper, Rob Buckman on the right-hand side of the table, Kathy Shadle, and Jordan Peterson on the left-hand side of the table for a mostly civilized and very engaging discussion tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.